Hello, welcome back to the GM's Guide. I'm your host, Dan Felder, your kind and merciful GM. And today you guys are in for a treat, because not only are we going to be talking about one of my absolute favorite topics, not only does it involve dungeon design, which I know based on the view counts is one of the things you guys love hearing us talk about, but yes, there is an us. That's the real reveal. Which is that I have a really good close friend, Gabe, who I've done a lot of awesome gaming with. He's helped me with a ton of things. And he recently told me a story about a session he ran just this week, as of recording, that was absolutely awesome. So good, I wanted to get him on here to share it with you all. So, hello, Gabe. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Gabe. For those of you who've been a long-time listener, you might know me as the player of Nathaniel Sky in Dan's Raven Shadow game. I'm also,
Mm-hmm.
as Dan said, a longtime collaborator with him. I've helped him refine and test many games and RPG systems he's made. I'm also a regular DM. I currently run a weekly game, and I play in several others, and I've run a number of games throughout the years. Anyway, let's get back to the topic, Dan.
Right. So, yes, we're going to be talking about something that we call lore dungeons. Now, this was a concept that sort of evolved after a bunch of experimentation and soul searching for me in college. When I was thinking about, we've got combat encounters, we've got role playing encounters. What would a role playing dungeon look like? I know what a combat dungeon looks like. I know what a trap dungeon looks like. What would the role playing equivalent of a dungeon be like? And so this is to role playing as a dungeon is to combat encounters. Like it's a superstructure of some sort. And so that was sort of a weird concept I kicked around in my head for a long time. I asked people about it, we would talk and work about it, and eventually this really cool formula emerged that we've used extremely successfully in a whole bunch of games in my sort of group of friends. Um, Gabe, can you explain what is a lore dungeon?
Yeah, I can, Dan. So, any dungeon should be an expression of the characters and events that went into creating it. That's just a way of making sure that your dungeon is cemented in your world and feels like a real structure that someone would actually build. It's very good to have a reason for the dungeon's construction in mind when you make one. However, in a lore dungeon, that story behind why and how the dungeon exists becomes the main focus of the dungeon, especially how the players interact with and discover the story of that dungeon, usually through a combination of exploration and investigation. This is required in order for them to complete the dungeon. As in order to get through, they have to learn about and understand the story of how this dungeon came to be, or the story of the dungeon's creator. This will often provide insight into the mind of the dungeon's constructor, or reveal a weakness of an enemy they must face to complete the dungeon. Playing a lore dungeon is like a mix of archaeology and crime scene investigation. Now, we could sit here and just tell you that this works, but I think it's good if we help provide some context as to why this kind of dungeon is good. And I think Dan has some pretty good examples here of why.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that I think is really fun by itself. So this whole concept evolved kind of when I was looking at incredibly successful games like Myst, where you explore areas that have these rich stories. A Gone Home's another example. And then there's also a lot of, really mainstream ones. I mean, Myst was crazy mainstream, actually. But the point is that you're dropped into a somewhat unusual location, and you're trying to figure out what happened there. Like Gabe mentioned, there's a bit of archaeology there. There's a bit of often dealing with an old civilization, but a lore dungeon could be very recent. It could just be a manor that suddenly is deserted or haunted or mysterious. There's all sorts of cool things you can do. Another example is the classic Lovecraft story At the Mountains of Madness, in which they basically go to an ancient civilization in the Antarctica. They discover one there, completely by surprise. They had no idea it was going to be there. And they start learning the history of the civilization and the nature of the creatures that are hunting them now that they're there. So there's all sorts of great classic mainstream experiences that I wanted to recreate in a dungeon setting. And there's a lot of reasons why this is so good. So first off, you get your players to pay attention to the world you're creating. You get them to actually, because when the history of the place is relevant to them proceeding, when in order to understand the nature of the threat they're dealing with, like the monsters that are hunting them in the shadows, or if they need to understand how to get past certain areas with passwords and things like that, what are the passwords this type of person might have set up, once they have these incentives to understand the history of the place in order to know what they're dealing with and how to navigate it, then suddenly your players are asking you, oh, you said there are paintings on the walls? What are the paintings of? And you get to do all this great world building and your players care about it. And another reason it's so cool is that it's super memorable in that whenever you're taking notes about something, you remember things better because you are processing the information deeper. When you repeat something after it's said to you, you remember it better because you're processing the information deeper. When you use information in a video game, we don't tend to teach mechanics if you know what you're doing in a video game design just by flashing text on the screen, asking the player to read it once and then remember it. What we do to make sure players remember it more deeply and learn it more deeply is we ask them to use that information to solve a problem. So if we teach them how to do a wall jump that helps them get up to a high place, we don't just tell them about it and then not do anything with it for a few hours. What we do is we give them the information, put them in a situation where they can wall jump, and we put a treasure high up on the shelf to make them want to wall jump up to get to it. So then players learn it, have to process it enough to execute it, they do it, they get rewarded for it, so they care about it, and now they've learned the mechanic much more deeply, which means they'll remember how to do it much more deeply, which means they'll be talking about your dungeons for years. Gabe, you experienced this actually, didn't you?
Yeah, the first time I ever experienced anything relating to a lore dungeon was hearing stories from players of Dan's campaigns about specific dungeons he had run. In particular, I started hearing a lot of stories about a dungeon called the Vault of the Hell Dragon. And I think, Dan, being the one who ran this here, can probably provide a bit better context on what exactly that was.
Yeah, sure. So, Vault of the Hell Dragon was a modified version of a 4th Core adventure. I've talked about 4th Core before on the podcast, called Vault of the Worm Prince. And what I like to do with a lot of 4th Core adventures is they often have a really cool base, and then I like to get in and start tweaking and modifying them and changing them up to be my own sort of vision of what they are. Adding more lore to, and often one of the things I do is their dungeons are often have rich story and are very combat focused, and I wanted to do with this one was I'm going to try to make it very lore focused and make it all about the story and try to tie all these things together. So they actually already had a great foundation that I just built off of here, so I want to give them a ton of credit for that. But anyway, what happened was I was kind of bored of running dungeons. I had run tons of them. They took forever to build. I wasn't interested anymore in how they functioned. And ultimately, I was looking for a way to make myself excited about them again, which is when I discovered 4th Core and decided I'm going to try to do a lore dungeon out of this. So I ran this a weekend kind of right before finals in college. I did not realize how long it would take. I thought it would take about 6 hours. But the puzzles went a lot more engaged. People spent a lot more time looking at the drapery than I wasn't really used to. A lot more time discussing the motivations of the people that they were dealing with, not just charging through rooms and killing things. And they were much more interested in investigating every part of the dungeon. And so that, plus a few other things, and just not having a fully good understanding of how long it would take in general, it didn't take 5 hours, it took 16 hours. We started playing around like 2 o'clock on Sunday, and we just went straight to breakfast afterward. It was completely insane. It was a marathon just to play the whole time through, and that was how enthralling it was. Players stayed engaged that entire time. So that should give you a bit of a context of you wondering, is exploring story and history, archaeology, crime scene stuff, is that going to be fun? Is that going to be compelling? Yes! Yes, it absolutely was. And then I ran this dungeon later, actually, for my D&D summer camp just over the course of 3 days. And they were totally enthralled as well. So 10-year-old kids were fascinated by this stuff. So it worked really well. But anyway, enough preamble. What is the Vault of the Hell Dragon? Gabe, you actually got a chance to play in the Vault of the Hell Dragon when I ran it later for testing out a new system. So can you explain the summary of sort of what's going on in this dungeon? What's the high-level stuff?
So at the high level, the Hell Dragon is this ancient entity of sorts who was some kind of hellish combination of demon, devil, something fiendish, and dragon. The scary thing about this combination is that instead of normal fire, this dragon breathed hellfire, which in Dan's settings usually means that being killed by this does not just kill you, it obliterates your soul, so no resurrection is possible. It's some scary shit. So, this already quite frightening fiendish dragon was a major conqueror, and at one point had quite a vast empire, and that's not good for anyone under his rule, because as one might expect from a fiendish chromatic dragon, he was tyrannical and evil. So a group of 3 paladins, ancient heroic paladins, banded together, and they managed to defeat the dragon. Well, they didn't kill him, though. All they were really able to do was seal him away. So their bodies were laid to rest in a tomb with that dragon to keep him sealed away. And this was called the Vault of the Hell Dragon. And the context for the group going into it is that something has hastened the Hell Dragon's awakening. And he is now getting ready to return from his slumber. And that's bad for everyone. So the heroes have to go in and stop this.
Right, and it was one of the things that really hit the pressure of it was I did one of the things I like to do in these dungeons, and I put a real-time time limit on them. So like they would only have X number of hours total to beat the dungeon, at which point the dragon would fully emerge and come back. So there was a real-time pressure to solve this problem. There's a bit of extra stuff you could do to get time bonuses. I'll be talking about that at some point when I go through how I integrate real-time time limits into RPGs and how they work, which is really cool in of itself. But let's stay focused. So that was the high-level information that the players had going in. And one of the interesting points about it was not all of it was true. Now, one of the most fun things you can do in mysteries when you're setting up mysteries, and that's often what lore dungeons are, is players start with some faulty information or faulty assumptions and are slightly changed as they go along. So you might think that, oh, there was this great noble king who presided over this thing, and he heroically laid himself to rest. And as you investigate, you actually learn, oh, actually, this guy was an evil lich, and he was not a good guy. Not a good guy at all. And that's a cool moment when players discover that, because it changes their perception. I've talked about this before, about what a plot twist is, and they're really powerful to work in. So one of the things about it which was interesting is the actual layer that is revealed as players explore is that the Hell Dragon actually was killed by the 3 paladins, but he reincarnated, and so now he's in the dungeon as an egg about to hatch. And now that he's and the temple was hidden away by his followers that are still active in the dungeon to some extent centuries later. The very long-lived ones, the golem ones at least, and the living statues and so on. And also the immortal ones. Some of them are ageless, and demons and devils and dragons and stuff like that. And so the paladins were laid to rest there, not because they nobly chose to watch over him there. They were laid to rest there because the dragon actually, it turns out, admired them. They were worthy foes. They're the only people who could actually... They killed him! I mean, he killed them too, but he had his followers gather their ashes and entomb them with him because he thought they were cool. He thought they were pretty cool dudes for being able to kill him. And so those are fun wrinkles you get as you explore lore dungeons. But anyway, I'd like to talk about some of the really powerful moments that this worked and what made it a lore dungeon versus not. So Gabe, as I mentioned, you got a chance to play in this when I ran it again for another system. What are some of your best moments in this that work? Doesn't have to be lore moments. I hope they are. But what are some of the really great moments that happened there?
So, one of the most striking moments from the beginning of the dungeon is we come into this first chamber, and there is a statue of the Hell Dragon. And it's in the center on this die, and there are doors all around the room, and each of them has this little gem in the center. And we're wondering, okay, what does this do? And we're traveling with this NPC, famous explorer, archaeologist, and he starts investigating the statue immediately. He's looking at it, the mouth of it, all this other stuff. And, the rest of us are like, well, we gotta go through one of these doors at some point, so somebody goes to touch one of the doors. And the moment someone touches the door, that statue activates, spitting out a beam of hellfire directly into the investigating adventurer archaeologist companion we had.
He was standing in front of the statue.
And it obliterated him.
It came out of the dragon's mouth.
It obliterated him. He died immediately.
Yeah.
Which was great for us, because we'd been planning to kill him anyway, but we didn't expect it to happen so early. And it was this horrifying moment of immediately realizing, oh shit, this dungeon means business.
That worked out so well. Like, I knew that was something that could happen. I just didn't necessarily expect it would happen.
And it did. It was amazing. Just a great little moment. We were all laughing and scared at the same time.
Yes, and that was your introduction to Hellfire too, which worked out pretty well.
Yeah, that really put the fear of Hellfire into us. And so the other thing that we saw in this room is that statue was surrounded by a bunch of empty thrones. And we wanted to figure out what they did, so I went and sat in one. Sitting in these thrones caused us to see visions of the past of the Hell Dragon from his perspective. And we learned a little bit about his story, but what was really striking about that is there were two tidbits of information that we got from those, and we didn't even know how to properly parse them at the time, but they became really important later. One was we learned the name of a powerful devil that he had imprisoned somewhere in this vault. And the second was we learned the name of his father. Now, we later interacted with that powerful devil, and knowing his true name gave us a bit of power over him, which helped us make a more favorable deal with him. The second tidbit of information, knowing the name of the dragon's father, was actually vital to getting into his final chamber where he was reincarnating. And
yeah,
I think, Dan, was the adventure... Were those in the adventure, or did you add that?
Originally they were actually in the adventure. Like, the Fourth Core has done some awesome stuff. I do know that I did add a bit more value into some of those pieces. For example, there was like giving you more power over certain entities by knowing their name was something that I thought was really cool to bury that information. So if players find out a piece of information that says, by the way, there's a devil in this dungeon and its name is Golgothon, and you're going to want to remember that because then they'll have power over it, that's like players... That's not really a leap. It's not that cool. But if you see a powerful memory and you hear this roar as you see a devil twisting in agony, and the vision just says, and this was, I believe, from the original module, "You failed me for the last time, Golgothon," and you see him, like, you hear the devil laughing as he's imprisoned in this icy chamber, you're like, oh, okay, that shows the Worm Prince's power. Holy crap. And then you find the thing from the vision. You find this icy prison, and you're like, and there's a guy inside it, and you're like, oh crap, that guy's name's Golgothon, isn't it? And so you're able to use that information that you find in this new cool way. And so and because of that also, you're able to realize this guy's might be able to help us because he was clearly an enemy or resentful or opposed to the Worm Prince in some way. So you actually have that information to work with, right?
Yeah, it's really great. When we had more information to work with, things went a lot better. Now, that's not to say every part of this dungeon was quite as masterful. I'd actually say a number of the puzzles in this dungeon, because it was an adaptation of a dungeon rather than a purely intended creation of a lore dungeon, a lot of those puzzles both had nothing to do with the lore, but also were kind of asinine. I particularly remember one chamber we struggled in, which had a suit of armor, like a powerful suit of armor. And we came into it, and there's this writing on the wall, and we have no idea what to do with it, and lava is starting to fill this room. We're going to die if we don't figure out this puzzle. And it took like 2 or 3 hints before we even thought of what we were supposed to do. And it was like an inverse number swap puzzle with Roman numerals.
It was really arbitrary. It had nothing there was no reason anyone would create this puzzle in the dungeon. It was already in the module. But that's not really a defense, because the modules, I want to emphasize, is freaking brilliant. It has all the sorts of great stuff. But a lot of the puzzles were much more like, I want to design a puzzle that's sort of in a brain teaser book. They're not necessarily things that would make any sense that would be created by a cult worshipping this ancient hell dragon. Nothing approaching some of the other things which the dungeon book also offered, which were really good. Like, for example, at one point you come before a statue of the Worm Prince's father, and you have to give it 3 offerings: one of like flesh, one of spirit, and one of I think wealth or something. There was 3 offerings, and people realized, okay, what does that mean? What is an offering of spirit? What is an offering of, flesh? And second, we have to give offerings that will not insult them. It has to be offerings that they find. They said give worthy offerings only. Otherwise, bad things will happen. And we know these things breathe hellfire, which is a great way of setting up that the boss itself, breathed hellfire and what that would mean for you guys. And so one thing that I believe, I don't remember if this happened with you. Did you guys give it any dragon flesh because you had like a dragonborn with you?
We did.
Or draconian?
We did.
Right. Talk about that.
I was playing a dragonborn, and you might remember Dan was mentioning earlier that we were given some false information going in. Some of those false information tidbits we got were directly harmful to interacting with the dungeon. In fact, basically what we had was a list of rumors, and some of these rumors were true, and some of these were false. In order to make it worthy enough to act on, the rumors were mostly true, but there were a couple of really, really false ones. And one of the false ones said, offer dragon blood to the statue. Well, my character was a dragonborn, so offer some dragon blood as the flesh offering. The rumor says it is a good idea, and maybe it will be. We were just under the assumption that we'll act on all of them, and since most of them should probably be beneficial, we'll end up better off than worse off. Well, putting dragon blood in that statue's offering bin really, really pissed it off and got us all blasted with some hellfire. Luckily, none of us were obliterated.
Yeah, it has to actually kill you in order for you to, to lose your soul. So that was good. I think it reduced your maximum HP or something for a long time, but yeah, it was bad. But the point is, the reason why that was pissed off the dragon statue was because it was enchanted with a sentience of knowledge of what its master wanted. Is that one of the major character traits that was revealed, and you could pick up when you started looking at the murals of what they glorified and what they hated, was the dragon. The Worm Prince is half devil, he's half dragon, and he freaking loves dragons. He glorifies dragons. He thinks dragons are the master race, all that sort of stuff. And so offering dragon blood to this thing was a huge insult. And interesting, every single group that has come across, whether it had that rumor or not, usually assumed, bigger sacrifice, dragon blood. And so they tend to go into that and oh crap, that insulted him. And they learn through doing about the character if they haven't already. If they have already, they feel really smart. Oh, sweet, let's not do that. And there's another wrinkle too to the character that's sort of revealed as you play, which is he's half devil, he's half dragons. You think, oh, he loves dragons, he must love devils. No, he hates devils. He absolutely despises that half of his heritage. And so if you offered devil blood or devil flesh to this Maw, you got a benefit and an extra blessing. So this is a good example, I think, about how learning the lore of the dungeon has real specific consequences. And this applies to characters too. Gabe, want to talk about the Paladins?
Oh, yes. So, here was a great moment where paying attention to the scenery really helped us out, and also thinking through the lore and understanding the people around us. So we came across in our adventures the tomb of the 3 paladins who killed the Worm Prince. And their ghosts appeared to us and offered us challenges of virtue. Now, before their ghosts appeared, we had been looking around the room, and we saw on the urns that held their ashes various virtues written on them. One said honor. What did the other one say, Dan?
I think one said mercy or compassion. I forget which word I used. One said honor, and one said courage.
Right. The first 2 tests, mercy and courage, were fairly standard. I can't even remember them that well, but they were about what you would expect when imagining, okay, how would a paladin of a virtuous soul test someone on this?
Right. So courage, I can actually give you the exact thing to fill this in. So courage's test was the guy, and it was actually really crucial to what was setting it up. It didn't seem so at the time, which was important, but it was crucial. So the paladin said, for courage, said, are you willing to pledge your lives in this test, so that if you fail, you will all die. That courage, if you are found wanting in the virtues, you will all die. Now, in this dungeon, you could respawn after you died, because you had like a resurrection machine outside. It was a very high-tech setting mixed with this very high-tech adventurers running across this ancient, powerful, magical threat. So you were fighting basically greater demons, but you were using lightsabers to fight them and ray guns and so on. So you could actually take them on. But what happened was that he set up the first test of courage was having the courage to accept that your lives are on the line. And if you died and respawned, you still got some significant penalties. So it was really, really, really bad. And getting a whole TPK would have basically been catastrophic for your chances of completing the adventure. So that was the first test. The compassion test involved a imp that was tormenting the paladins and choosing whether to kill it or not. But then finally we had the test of valor.
Well,
and yes, so yes, the setup was, and I'll toss it over to you. The setup was after these sort of tests with these wise paladins talking and speaking the very somber. The final paladin, Gabriel Face Shadow, walked up and says, "Yeah, we're gonna fight," which got a laugh from the group. And he and this other paladin started arguing, saying, "Why are you testing them in combat? Like that, it doesn't matter if they're good in combat or not. The important thing is that they are worthy to try using the weapons we're going to give them, because they're our only hope of beating the Worm Prince." And they argue about it and says, "No, I'm going to fight these guys, and if they can't beat me, they're not worthy of my sword." And the other paladin rolls his eyes, and then you can see, Gabe, continue.
Yeah, so the Gabriel Face Shadow, he's going to come and fight us, and then the paladin who hadn't been involved in the argument casts some kind of paralyzing spell on him and says, "Now, strike him while you have a chance."
Because he's going to kick your ass.
Yeah. Like, we have no chance of beating him on our own. And the other party members, they're gearing up like they're going to do this. Because you may have guessed by now by the fact that we made deals with the devil and had planned to kill our guide, that we weren't exactly good guys, which made it really funny for us trying to convince these paladins we were virtuous enough to use their weapons in the first place.
Good enough, guys.
But the moment my friends start doing this, my character, a rather pragmatic sort, is like, wait a second, this isn't the test. Like, fighting isn't the test. The test is whether we take that opportunity to strike him while he's down. But his urn didn't say valor, it said honor. Honor means not striking an opponent who's messed up. So as one of my friends is going in to attack him...
He's announced the attack.
Yeah, he's announcing the attack. I'm like, no, I tackle him. And I'm like, that's the test. We can't attack him. And because I noticed this and because I acted on it, we ended up passing the Paladins' tests. Whereas if he had been allowed to follow through on that strike, we would have failed. And we would have lost powerful implements that were almost, like, necessary to defeat the Worm Prince. We would have been sorely overpowered if we did not have those. Like, he would have overpowered us easily.
Right. Like, you still had a chance to win, but it would have been like, so did any of us survive versus did we all survive?
Yeah.
And so, like, that I thought was really good. And what was great was, it was really awesome that you saw that. And so the main clue was, I mean, you can kind of guess Noble Paladins, is this a good idea or not? So that's why I set up the idea of the courage, saying, no, we have to do this or we're going to die, which also set up the other thing of the Paladins being able to say, like, why a Paladin might try to paralyze him in order to say, like, no, because he might value your lives. And also, it set up the sort of fake argument to imply that the other Paladins might not be okay with this. They might think this was really stupid. So, with all that was good, but if you paid attention to the room, if you paid attention to the history of these characters, you heard that Gabriel Fayshadow was this honorable, wise character, which maybe was wrong, maybe that's not true, maybe he is a thug, but it's something that's unusual. And then also, his urn, as you mentioned, Gabe, his virtue, the other ones were correctly listed as honor and as of courage and compassion, but his was listed as honor, not valor. And that worked out really well for you guys. So, yeah, that was, I thought, a really great moment as well. Just for you guys to have that big triumphant thing, to literally save the party from a TPK because you're paying attention to role-playing.
Right. And I think it added a lot more fun to the dungeon. Like, I am a serious role player. When I play D&D, when I run a D&D game, I am primarily focused on the stories that we're telling, the characters we're interacting with, and just having a good time inhabiting a world. I want my worlds to feel alive. I want the characters to feel like they're reacting naturally to the players. So for me, having these lore interactions in a dungeon, which is normally to a player like me just a hellscape of combat and traps, it engages a type of player that isn't normally engaged by dungeons. And it's very fun. And I think you really hit on something when you started working on these. And I think moving past just the example of the Vault of the Helldragon, you and I kind of hammered out some ideas on what is important when building this kind of dungeon. You want to start us off there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first pillar that we've talked about is that the dungeon's going to have a backstory, right? And the players come in and they're going to learn about this dungeon story. But it has to be simple to grasp, extremely simple, because it's dripped out in confusing and disorganized chunks, and for players to discover for themselves. And if it's not simple, they're going to get confused, and they're going to get to weird, crazy interpretations. Just look at like online theories about what's going on in things like Five Nights at Freddy's, and if you look at things like Dark Souls, what's going on with the lore and all the different competing theories. Often the story is very, very simple in essence, but if it has any number of moving parts at all, people put them together in different orders, it can be very confusing. Most mysteries are very, very simple stories. The interesting thing is trying to how you go about figuring it out and learning that information. Like, some of the most complex and dense Agatha Christie mysteries can be summarized like this. The butler did it. Why? Because he was in love with his master's wife and he wanted her to be a widow. That's it. That's the whole thing. But going through red herrings and getting pieces, having to figure out pieces from yourself and realizing, oh, we found a letter in his drawer that has a red lipstick imprint on it, and that's interesting because he was avowed he was an avowed bachelor, and did he have someone that was interested in him? And then you find out later, oh, the lipstick matches the wife's version of lipstick, and then you start realizing, oh, were they having a thing? And then there's other stuff going on, and that all ties together. And so the path to discovering it makes it a fascinating mystery. Likewise, this was a dungeon created by jungle elves to protect a magical gem. It has now been taken over by a beholder who has added his own wrinkles to the dungeon's traps and monsters. Two simple ideas. Jungle Indiana Jones dungeon created by elves. Beholder's taken over it now, and he's made it weirder. That's a pretty simple story, but it's a good basis for a lore dungeon. The richness comes from the details of what the elves are like, the personality of the beholder, etc. So that's the first major piece. You've got to have this cool story, and it's going to be tempting for you to go nuts and create this really complex narrative. But the essence of it should be simple overarching core, and then you can get really interesting into the details. That's principle 1. So Gabe, what is principle 2?
The second principle of these kind of lore dungeons is that the players need to feel like they're part of the story. Even if the story has already happened, even if they can't interact with the characters involved, they have to feel engaged, because otherwise the players don't feel the need to interact with it. This doesn't have to be a complex lure. It can be as simple as making the mystery of it relevant to their current goals. For example, when discovering the Hell Dragon and fighting him in his vault, uncovering his history was relevant to the players and part of their story, because it wasn't just a matter of the Hell Dragon being some enemy we needed to kill. It was a matter of, this is a powerful enemy we need to understand, or we will not be able to kill them. And even just to understand them, we have to get to them. And since we were killing this villain of these stories, we become a part of it, almost like the epilogue of it. And that, we even did interact with some of the characters of the old story in the form of the Paladins, and the monsters that had been trapped here for decades or eons. And in another way, you can really draw your players in to varying levels. For example, a really cool idea for a dungeon I've seen before is where the players are investigating an abandoned manor or an abandoned state building, and as they investigate the dungeon, they trigger these kind of ghostly flashbacks or otherwise supernatural events where they are temporarily displaced back in time to the night that this manor became so distraught and uninhabitable. To uncover what happened there and understand that story, then pulling them back to the present to learn where to find what they need from it. So, I think that's going to kind of lead us into our next principle, which, Dan, I'll let you take over.
Yeah, absolutely. So just one thing I want to add on the last one too, because you got me thinking, was, and like, you could even do something that feels like you are fulfilling the wishes of the characters that had made this thing happen to begin with. So, for example, if you have the War of the Ring, is a good example of this in Lord of the Rings, that you have this big backstory of the conflict, of the war against Sauron, and the ring is sliced off his finger, and it should have ended that day, but it didn't, and now you're sort of picking up the pieces of this happening again. Well, maybe you're the guy who finally ends it. And so that's something I think that you can pull off. Or, for example, let's say you've got a tragic story about a kingdom that has basically this ancient, powerful knowledge that people feared because it was giving them all this magical power, and Templars came and just tried to destroy the city, but they locked the library away, and the high priestess cursed the land and created this horrible mausoleum of shades rather than let them destroy all the people and the knowledge, because they were going to die anyway. I'm making this up off the top of my head. But basically, this was this big battle over this knowledge, and it was sad that the knowledge was lost here. And maybe your goal is to come and sort of fulfill that dying sacrifice and make it worthy by being the people who finally take the library scrolls and recover it. And that actually makes the sacrifice no longer in vain, because she did that hoping to preserve the knowledge, and now you're the one who ultimately comes down and makes it worthy. So things like that can connect you to the story, even if none of the characters are still in place. So, but tying back to this, the third principle I would say is that since players are not guaranteed to follow your exact path, you need to make sure the story works even when read out of order. Now this ties back to this. This is one reason that the story needs to be simple, because players are not going to necessarily put it together in the right order or necessarily even get all the details right. But it means that you need to often be filling in details and twists when players discover more, not necessarily just put in new chunks of the story. Like, you might, for example, know that there was an amazing kingdom, and then something bad happened, and then everybody died, and that's the overall story. And then you can learn later who the leader of the kingdom was, what happened to destroy the civilization, why, and who made that happen, why did they make that happen. Those are all pieces you can kind of learn in different orders, and they end up filling out and fleshing out a concept, which is a way to make it make sense, despite learning it out of order, versus if you try to, say, tell Hamlet out of order, it's not going to really flow together very well.
Yeah.
So that, yeah. But anyway, if this sort of ties to another concept as well. So that if you have this surface idea and then you put together details to figure out more depth, why is there a reason to dig any deeper? Which leads into, Gabe?
Well, the fourth principle is that you need to reward digging deep. But it's important to remember when you're designing this way that you should never punish your players for not digging deep enough. You want to have levels of detail. The easiest stuff to discover should be what lets them complete the dungeon. The hard stuff to discover should yield deeper insight and rewards. For example, understanding the Helldragon's hatred of devils, as we explained earlier, was a non-obvious way to gain a benefit from that sacrifice room. And it can give you access to hidden treasure troves. Also, understanding personalities of characters you're interacting with, like the Paladins, allows you to do what they expect or what they want from you, such as pass the trial of honor, which was disguised as a trial of valor. And this stuff is really important to making your players feel like that digging was actually important to them. And it will help train your players that interacting at a deeper level with your world is an engaging and rewarding prospect on all counts. But the other thing that this deeper digging does is it lets you give the players more rewards and more sense of accomplishment when they've completed the dungeon, without sacrificing any of their ability to complete it. So,
yeah.
Then now we're getting towards the kind of end of the dungeon area, and we have one last principle on what players should be able to do at the end of the dungeon, regardless of how deep they dug. Which, Dan?
Yeah, so basically at the end of the dungeon, players need to be able to explain the dungeon's backstory to another group. Now, this might sound obvious, but it's important to keep it in mind while you're putting this together. It's very easy to come up with this big, mysterious ideas that you're sort of hinting at the whole time, and you just sort of hint and hint to keep everything obscure. And then at the very end, players are like, well, that was weird. I guess it was some sort of weird civilization, and they can't latch onto it. So at some point, you need to turn the corner, and you need to say, no, here's what happened. You have to give them that moment. I like to do this technique called the slow dawn, in which you sort of give people an optimal moment to make the leap for themselves, and then solidify it thereafter. So you start by giving them just a little hint, and then a stronger hint, and then a stronger hint, and then it goes bigger and bigger until players absolutely cannot miss it. You basically just tell them what's going on if they find the right thing, which means that they feel cool, that their suspicions are confirmed if they guess early, but also it means that if they were absolutely going to miss it, then it's still given to them. And doing this gives players the maximum opportunity to make the leap themselves without having to try to guess exactly what tiny hint you need to give them. So as you're planning out this dungeon, you should be making sure that eventually you're going to make sure that players have a good understanding of what happened and why. It's reinforced several times, so if they miss one detail, they don't put together one puzzle piece correctly, they're not going to miss the whole thing. And the reason you want this is because starting mysterious is cool. It makes us curious. But if we never learn the answer to the mystery, we just get frustrated. And eventually our brains say, we can't solve this puzzle. It's annoying. It sends us displeasurable feelings, which we learn to turn away from, and we do something else. So you want players to eventually have the aha moment to go with the huh moment. And that also will make the dungeon more memorable, because if they can explain it to other players, then not only is that gratifying, but they're going to often talk about the story, and it's going to dive more deeply into that experience for them and be something that they treasure a lot more. So always try to remember that your end goal is that players will have gotten through the mystery and be able to explain it to another group. Now, anyway, we have talked a long time about all these different things and pieces putting together, so let's go into the reason why we did this podcast. Gabe, you ran a lore dungeon recently, and I just want to shut up and let you talk about it.
Alright, so I think for this lore dungeon, it's necessary to have a little bit of context about the campaign it's taking place in. The current party is a group of people in a world that I've made myself, heavily based on Norse mythology, but with my own twist and spin on things, of course, and a healthy dose of classic medieval fantasy. The enemy that they've been dealing with is an incredibly powerful jester called the Silent Jester. They know almost nothing about her, other than in the first session, she showed up with a carnival, and they put on a show, and at the end of the show, she held up a tarot card, one of the trump cards, in this case, the Tower, which generally represents disaster, and sucked the souls out of most of the audience. Which is never a nice introduction to a character. You tend to maybe fear them a little bit after that. But the party follows them and tracks them down, and, well, the rest is just kind of side material from there in terms of relation to this story. But really, what's important is that this is a powerful villain who they're tracking. They know they're doing bad things, but they don't know where they are right now. They can't find them because the Jester hasn't left them any clues. They don't know much at all about the Jester. The Jester doesn't even speak. That's why she's called the Silent Jester. So, with very little clues left, they've gone to a powerful divination wizard who is named Elias, and he's an elf who works in the employ of a powerful dragon in this setting. Yes, a dragon who commands an army. And Elias is his battle mage, and this dragon is all about caution and thinking things through. So his battle mage is a powerful divination wizard. And the divination wizard talks to the players, and he says that, he could probably divine where they are, but he wants something out of them. And he tells them about this lost artifact that is believed to be within the ruins of a ancient dwarven city. The city is called Arkingthird, and the last king, Hjalti Ironbringer, was said to have sealed the city in the midst of a great plague to prevent its spread. The story is already pretty much set up right there. That is the basic overview of the story. Hjalti Ironbringer was the king of the dwarves in Arkingthird, which was the center of an ancient dwarven empire. And during the midst of a horrible plague, he sealed the city to prevent the plague from spreading. And ever since the city was sealed, it's been lost to time. Now, the little minor details that help build that up are that the Ironbringer clan or family of dwarves was the power of that city because of two reasons. One was that they invented a powerful smithing technique for iron that made it possible to quickly and easily mass produce it for use in weapons and armor. The second reason they'd acquired so much power is they were known for powerful divination magic, which they used to divine the location of ancient ore deposits that they could use to find the iron needed to keep up their level of production.
Right. And this is all like the setup of the overarching history of the world,
Yes.
and which is the general things that you need to know going on. Which I assume that you dripped in through sort of history check style things and so on,
Yeah, yeah.
or just backstory.
History check,
Right.
things Elias told them. And the last piece of information that was really important to them going in is the disease itself that he sealed against. They made history checks to understand this. They didn't need to know the exact details of it to know that it was kind of scary, but what they learned from investigating it was that this disease was called iron lung. And what it did is it caused parts of the body to undergo a strange form of calcification into iron, which eventually caused blood, parts of the lungs, and other parts of the body, and the disease started in the lungs, which is why it was called iron lung instead of just iron death, or something similar. Would eventually their body would just be torn up by the iron bits now calcified within them, and they would just bleed out or cough up all their blood. Horrifying way to die. And it was also a curse disease, which meant that any kind of cure disease magic wouldn't work on its own, and any kind of cure curse magic wouldn't work on its own. You needed to expertly combine both, and in the right order and way, to actually cure this kind of disease. And at the time, none of the dwarves who, to be honest, aren't exactly known for their great spellcraft, really divined or figured this out. But, so that's the context the players have going into the dungeon. And then when they get there, they have to find it, too. They are told a general location in the mountains, and they have to search it out, basically only knowing that it's a sealed dwarven city. But they manage to do so. It's a long mix of survival checks and just cleverly looking around the area, trying to find tracks of ancient roads and other things. And they get to this entrance, and right off the bat, I mean, it does not look good. The top entryway in Old Dwarvish is emblazoned with "Do not enter, dead inside." Slightly riffing off of Walking Dead there, but the players, they kind of like, well, we gotta go get this orb if we want to find our villain. This is our main way through right now, so they uncover some of the snow in front of it, and they walk into this hallway, and it's this grand kind of entry hallway emblazoned with dwarven ruins, as very much inspired by the dwarves, or the Dwemer in Skyrim, and Morrowind, but mostly the architecture in Skyrim with the really heavily intricate stone carvings, though without the ancient, like, piping and other steampunk elements that the Dwemer kind of have. And as they go through this, they keep seeing, like, carved into the archways of this tunnel, "Turn back, this is death awaiting you, do not unseal the city." Like, somebody really wanted to make sure that anyone coming here didn't do this. And they finally get to this door that's, like, barred in front of them. And, like, we're talking like a heavy stone bar placed on a huge stone door that's carved with dwarven figures producing iron and weapons. And there's a skeleton next to the door, and this is where I feed them their first piece of information. about the city itself and what happened, but it's a note from this dead dwarf by the door, essentially it's his final will and testament because he's gonna die. And he knows it. He's already sick. But he's the one that the king has chosen to actually go seal the city. Like, he sealed the main entrance door, and then he sealed this door to keep people from getting out. And he's going to die alone in the hallway. So his last thoughts in this very desperate time are kind of written down on this last note for anyone to find. And basically chronicle not a lot of information. All it says really is, how important he feels that he was the one chosen to do this, how much he fears for the future of his people, and how much he hopes that someone will remember his sacrifice. And it's a bit of a sobering moment, right? Because you can see right here already a victim of the disease. But it doesn't prepare the players for what happens when they pull off the bar of that door and start to push it inwards. And I describe the scene as they are pushing skeletons, piles of skeletons, away from the door. People who looked like they were clawing and screaming at the door, trying to get out. And immediately it cemented in the players' minds that this was a horrifying event. These people, in their last moments, were crying, screaming, and clawing their way towards this door, trying to escape the madness going on around them. And beyond this pile of skeletons, beyond the door, to starkly contrast this horrifying scenery, is a beautiful bridge over a grand chasm. It's as though the mountain itself is entirely hollow, which to some extent it is, because of the dwarves' excavations over time. And across from this bridge over the large chasm, they see this refined entrance building with huge dwarven statues, well preserved, dwarven carvings. Like, this would have been people's first view of the grand capital of the dwarves back in the day. And this building is imposing and beautiful in all the right ways. And when they look down from the bridge, they can see just how vast this city was, because down deeper and deeper they can see bridges crossing, buildings built into the side of the cliffs, and down at the bottom a pool of lava where they can see working machinery still to this day pulling up lava to be used in the forge. And I think it was kind of just a striking moment and a good image to start on this journey they were going on. So the players go into the building, and the building essentially serves as a checkpoint, like an immigration office almost in the modern day equivalent, where people would be checked into the city, any contraband would be confiscated, where caravans would be checked to make sure that they were not doing anything illicit. And there's more people dead in here. In fact, this room is filled with like rotted stone cots or rotted beds or other things that were a long time ago used to treat the sick. Like, this big room in the top of the city became a center of people being cared for while they were dying of this horrible disease. And there are skeletons everywhere in here too. And as the players are entering this room, they kind of hear this wailing and moaning, and the angry spirits of all the people who died here and at the door start to materialize. You know, when D&D, when spirits or people have a gruesome or horrifying end, they often come back as a vengeful or angry ghost. And so the players are forced to fight the remnants of these sick dwarves who died horribly. And the whole thing leaves them very on edge, right? Because now they know that nowhere in this city is perfectly safe. If they try to rest here, if they try to tarry too long, it's likely that the spirits will wake up, that the spirits will come and get them, because it's hard to believe that anyone had an, a peaceful death in the event that went on here. And this is also where the players were able to find their second piece of lore, which was a logbook about caravans coming in and out of the city, which the guy making it actually jotted some notes or his own thoughts in occasionally, commenting on, oh, this guy was weird, or oh, this caravan had some of this, or even actually saw signs of corruption when he had allowed a caravan without marking down any of its contents. Uh, so that kind of just told the players a date when caravans were no longer admitted into the city. It gave them the definite time. So because these log entries were all dated, the players now knew exactly when the city was sealed, which helped provide a context of time frame for how long it took the city to go to shit when the disease first started, and also a marking point for how long did it take everyone to die after it was sealed. And as they continue on deeper into the city, there's the occasional encounter with ghosts to remind the players that this is a horrifying place. I especially tried to use those ghost encounters when they were investigating areas with a particularly high amount of death. But I also tried to describe the kind of stark death of the city in other aspects, in how quiet things were, or how just empty it felt in certain areas that had been more about popular commerce or recreation, areas that would not have been used during a crisis. And eventually the players come across several journal entries. There are several stories that I weaved into this. One was the diary of an apothecary in the city who had been trying to treat the disease, and her attempts at curing it and treating it, her failure, and eventually her own realization that she has succumbed to it and losing faith in her ability to find a cure. And, of course, the entries just stop abruptly at a certain point, indicating that she has died of this illness. And another story they find is of a guard who talks about how one of their co-workers early on in this disease's life cycle just kind of didn't show up to work one day, and then they're just kind of talking about business as usual, and the game of poker they were playing with their other guard buddies that night, and how the guy still didn't show up, and just calling him a baby because he won't come in, and it's just some small cough. And then just a story of another guard who had seen the captain go into her office in the guard building and just lock it, and she never came out after the city had been sealed. And eventually the players made their way into the guard building, which I included some really good opportunities for them to gain rewards for actually understanding the story here, which is that if they'd read enough of the diary entries, they would know about where the office to the guard captain was and how to open it. And they did. So when they opened it there, they found the guard captain's master set of keys. They found her suicide note, where she basically denounced the king as a jackass. And they also found that she had been having an affair with the king, which was an important clue for those keys to know that one of the keys on that ring would be the key to the king's bedchamber, since she had special access to him. And because of finding the guard's keys, they were also able to open up the storage area of the guard headquarters, where they could find a couple of magical items that were the reward for discovering where the guard captain had died and discovering their keys. And finally, they make their way into the castle, the palace of the Dwarven King, and they are able to find his journal and learn about his side of the story. And what they uncover is that the plague was created by an archdevil that his family had actually sold their souls to. And selling their souls to that Archdevil was why they had been able to learn that iron smelting technique. The devil gave it to them. And in order to keep finding those iron veins, it wasn't because they were good divination casters. They were using his power with sacrifices and this crystal ball object that they were sent to retrieve to find the ore veins. And
So that's the example of the misinformation and the reveal.
yes, yeah, that is the misinformation there. And when they then
In terms of, just to clarify, that before you had established that that the reason they must be so good at this was because that history had assumed that it was because they were great at divining. That's what they told people.
right,
Right. So yeah, but in reality, it was because of this horror.
yeah. And this king had come to the point where he was like, this deal was terrible. We sold our souls for what, a couple of riches and some power? This is shit. We are forced to kill people and sacrifice our own family's prestige for this terrible deal our ancestors made, and I'm not having any of it. So he is detailing steps he was taking to break that contract. And the Archdevil found out about it, and as punishment he unleashed the plague with basically the threat of, I'm just going to let this keep going. I can cure it, but only if you relent and start sacrificing to me again. And the last Dwarven King was an incredibly stubborn man, and you could already see that from the entries of people who had been around him that they had found, of trying to convince him of other things, and him never going along with that. And so he was like, nope, it's not worth it. And he sealed the city to stop the disease from spreading, and ended up killing all of his own people to break his contract. And at the end of the dungeon, the players were able to acquire the crystal ball by using the knowledge from the king's diary to enter this secret room where they'd been doing the sacrifices. And while they're in there, they accidentally activated the pool and get a direct line to that Archdevil. Now they flee.
The one that you've just built up with this huge empire of his handiwork.
Yeah, they've literally been staring at the horror he has wrought this whole time. And they go and they run away as soon as the the devil gets called. They don't even stay.
I mean, I do not blame that.
They don't even stay long enough for him to see them through the pool, because he's kind of lackadaisical about answering it, because he's a powerful archdevil. He doesn't need to be immediate, and also he hasn't had a call from this line in centuries, actually.
Hello, darkness,
over
my old
1,000
friend.
years. And he opens it and he's like, hello? Huh, must be the rats. Dang, I was interested. And so they just get this small preview of this character. And the secret thing is that they don't know yet, but the Jester is working with this Archdevil. And so he will be important as a villain later. So not only do I have the story tied to them in terms of they're trying to find this object in the city, so that's why they need to engage, but I've added this extra element of this horrible city was also a preview of a character that will be much more important later. And yeah, that is the story of the lost city of Arkingthird. Thanks for letting me come on and tell it, Dan.
No, I absolutely loved that. I love how it starts off. It's just very like, oh yeah, it's sort of a dwarven kingdom, and here's some story, and they do metal, and you're like, yeah. And then by the end, you're just like, just digging fingers into the table. At least I was when I was listening to it. Yeah, thanks for coming on and sharing it. It has a very Dark Souls-y vibe, where it's like this fetid kingdom full of the dead, and there's horrifying scenes, and this somber, disgusting horror mixed with beauty and dignity, and then everything is being learned about through item descriptions. I think my favorite wrinkle in that whole thing was the explanation of even why a guard captain would have a key to the king's bedchamber. Like that, even that had an element of story to it, and you are getting to know as you're exploring these little small threads and lives weaving through this apocalyptic situation, which added meaning and tragedy to the whole thing. And then everything else snowballs to building up the freaking devil, which is just, oh, that's just so cool. That's just really cool.
Well, thanks, Dan. Oh, I'm glad you enjoyed the story. I think it was really fun
was awesome.
to come on here and talk about it. And
Great.
I think, we've given players a lot of things to think about with building up lore dungeons for themselves. And I really hope that some of the listeners send in some stories of what they build. That'd be really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. You can contact me at DesignerDanF on Twitter. I do respond to people there. You can also send me an email at designerdanf@gmail.com. If you like this podcast, please leave a 5-star review on iTunes. That's super helpful. And seeing people appreciate the podcast makes us want to spend time to actually do it. And if you like Gabe, let us know, because I was hoping that we can absolutely do some more stuff like this, Gabe. Did you have fun?
I had a lot of fun, Dan. I would absolutely enjoy coming back to talk about more elements of DMing and experiences we've had working together and collaborating. And I know I'm definitely going to have to come back for a certain story you'd like to tell down the line.
Yes. I really desperately want to talk about the major campaign we collaborated on, Fall of Disney. Is that what we ended up calling it?
I think we just kind of called it the Disney Adventure throughout the whole time we were running it. But
Yeah,
I think it's a story for another time, and
certainly.
they're definitely going to have to
Certainly.
tune in later to figure out more about that.
Yes, sir. All right. Well, thanks for listening again. Again, you can leave a 5-star review on iTunes if you appreciate the time that we spend making this. And yeah, give us a shout. Let us know your thoughts. And in the meantime, this is your kind and merciful DM signing off. See you in the next adventure.